Ready? All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is all about visualizing freight and safety data. My name is Ed Stracco. I'm going to moderate this morning. Have 4 great presentations, and it's really we're looking at freight data and decision making and a whole bunch of different things from hours of service to freight flows. It should be. I'm looking forward to it. It should be excellent. We'll probably do like 15 minutes presentations, have some questions in between each, and then if we have time at the end, we can have some more questions. All right, so first up, we have Stephen Eick.
Steve Eick.
Stephen Eick, sorry. from VIZ19. So Steve founded VIZ19, is in charge of VIZ19. He's I'd say a serial entrepreneur and startup.
Probably so. Yeah.
So you have a PhD in statistics.
Correct.
And worked at Bell Labs for many years. Got a ton of patents. I can't even believe that. No, the number's so high. What are you close to 50?
45, I think.
That's 45 more than I have.
The only use case now is that it's really helpful to have patents when the patent trolls come.
All right, so Steve's going to talk to us all about hours of service and visualization. Take it away, Steve.
Thanks. All right, so yeah, I am a serial entrepreneur. This is the 3rd startup company that I did. I thought I haven't come to a scientific conference in a number of years, so I thought it'd be fun to see if I can get more involved again. At VIZ19, we were an ELD vendor, electronic logging device. What that is it's a device that runs in a commercial vehicle, monitors the engine, monitors the drivers to make sure the driver complies with hours of service regulations. We go to market as a white label provider, so we're basically a feature in a lot of fleet management applications. I have about 100 companies that resell my software. Some, for example, I forget which ones we've done press releases and which ones we haven't. But for example, one of my resellers is AT&T. I think we're the largest white label provider, and I have about 45 people who work for my company. How does this thing work? Okay. You said there'd be a clicker to advance. And so for the heck of it, I got involved with the University of Illinois with the Master's in Business Analytics class, and I started to try to give, for their capstone project, try to give them some ELD data to see if we could do anything interesting with it. What I've noticed is that some of my much better funded competitors have all stood up data science teams. And so one guy has a data science team with 20 guys, typically it's 4 or 6, and of course we don't have $100 million in venture capital, so I can't afford to that, so I got to do it with graduate students. So the other thing I wanted to mention, as an ELD provider, I actually get real-time data from the engine every 2 seconds, for hundreds of thousands of vehicles. So this is, and from the engine bus, we sit on the engine bus, we can basically pick up anything that's published on the engine bus, which is pretty much anything the vehicle will do. So I thought it was really interesting. Yesterday, the Ford guy was sort of getting the hard braking events. Well, I can get hard braking events too. And so if anyone's sort of interested in collaborating, we also get fuel efficiency, anything on the engine bus, we can pull or change our software to pull, and go grab that and do something with it if there's something that's interesting to do. The hours of service regulations, the goal is to keep fatigued commercial drivers off the road. It's part of I think it started in 1913. The regulations 395.15.11.20, I mean, it's complicated. Basically, these regulations apply to all commercial vehicles over 10,000 pounds, hazmat, anyone who's involved in interstate commerce. Typically, in a fleet management application, about 10% of the trucks will need ELD. The goal is to monitor the drivers to make sure that the drivers don't drive if they're fatigued. The very simplest regulation is you can drive 11 hours a day. You have a 14-hour window that you can do the driving. You need to take 10 hours off duty for a shift reset. You have to take a 30-minute break at least every 8 hours. Now, I can't go, even close to 8 hours without taking a break. You can either go 60 hours over 7 days or 70 hours over 8 days. And if you take 34 hours off, so a day and a half, you reset your hours and start over. This is actually pretty simple. What makes this hard is government regulations. There are thousands, I'd say literally thousands of variations on these rules. You move to the next one. So adverse driving conditions, you get to drive 2 extra hours. A lot of vehicles qualify for what's called the short haul exemption. If you're a driver salesman, you get exclusions. Alaska's different. Agricultural operations are different. There's construction relief. There's emergency relief, the oil field exemption for oil field drilling companies, emergency driving conditions. It goes on and on and on and on. We actually probably one of the best in the industry at sort of coping with all these. These are just the federal rules. Now, of course, the states have to get into the game, so about half of the states have their own regulations if you're involved in intrastate commerce, which are different. If you cross a state boundary, it's interstate commerce, so you have to qualify for the federal rules. But if you stay within a state, you can use the state regulations. Or if you stay in the state enough days, you switch over. So that's probably about half. Like the most recent exemption that I think we're just deploying now is the Minnesota construction exemption. That's the USA. Now, Mexico has a different set of regulations. And Canada has different regulations too. And the Canadian provinces have different regulations. So this whole thing is crazy, stupid, complex because the regulations are so complicated. And I was told that there's 17,000 proposed changes. So from the drivers, can you advance the slide? So from the driver's point of view, the only thing the ELD is going to do is prevent them from driving and keep their earnings down. So they definitely do not like this application. From the motor carrier's point of view, the only thing that happens is if they don't comply with the regulations, they get a fine. So this whole thing is sort of bad for or I don't want to say bad, not wanted by the drivers, not wanted by the motor carriers, because the people that get the benefit of it are the rest of us who drive who aren't sort of commercial drivers. So it's sort of like paying your taxes. No one wants to do it, but you have to. Also, the other problem with this application is because of all the regulations, it's actually crazy, stupid, complex. And it's also extremely difficult to support. Can you advance to the next slide? What makes it hard to support is we have to have a real-time connection to the engine. So we have a mobile application that connects to the engine either via Bluetooth, via the Wi-Fi direct, or tethered. Get real-time engine data, so to do that, 100% reliable. We have to communicate with the back office, make sure that they have the portals working, that the fleet manager can monitor the drivers, get the locations, and make sure everyone's complying. And so you put the thing, anytime you're doing networking with non-technical people, it's support intensive. So what our business strategy is we're basically just trying to be that feature. We're trying to wrap it up, make it easy, have a support offer that sort of says, we'll take the pain away from you if you have to do ELD for 10% of your customers and you focus on what makes you money. And as a business, it's actually a pretty good value proposition. There's also a tremendous amount of fraud, because if the drivers can drive more, they earn more, so there's a huge incentive for them to cheat. So in order to stop the cheating, the FMCSA came out with a final rule 2015. It's been a 4-year transition period. The final compliance date's December 16, and was it 5 weeks? I'm so looking forward to it, because with the earlier regulations, the drivers could edit their logs. With the new regulations, they can't. So it's definitely going to make life easier as a software vendor. So the key requirements for our software is we're tracking the driving hours to make sure they comply with the regulations. Our software is integrally synchronized with the engine so they can't cheat. Integrated with the back office. There's also a requirement that we pass the data to the government upon request. Is what's called a data transfer. Now, when we pass the data to the government, we are required to degrade the location, degrade some other things, but of course we store it at full precision if we wanted to do something with it. So the way it works is there's a V-bus device that sits on the engine bus, and this is a picture of an ODB2 device. In the commercial vehicles, most are J1939 or 1708. It's called a Deutsch port that you typically connect to. Then we have Android and iOS applications. The one thing I had to learn was to program mobile devices, and compared to writing visualization code, programming these mobile devices is much more difficult. Much more difficult. We actually recalculate all the hours of service regulation on the mobile device every minute to predict when the guy is going to go into violation. Then we have to store that in the mobile device in case there's no networking, synchronize it with the back office when it comes on networking, and store all this stuff on Amazon Web Services. Right now, I'm accumulating about 80 million trips per month. So talking about some database sizes. Actually, when our database was about 2 terabytes, and it actually becomes quite a database management problem, just even sort of keeping up with the flow volume. And what I did notice is one of my much bigger competitors, their ELD actually went down on Sunday, and it's been down for a few days. And they have 5,000 employees, compared to our 45. Can we advance? When we started getting into this with the students, one thing that was really interesting is we found that drivers never have hours of service violations. This is really puzzling. How come the driver never has his hours of service violation? And the answer is the reason they never have them is because they always edit their logs so that they never will get an hours of service violation. So the objectives sort of switch between how do we visualize hours of service violation until how do we find out what the drivers are actually doing so they never have hours of service violations. So we started looking at since we did the ELD software, we know a lot more about what's happening than the driver does. We can actually record everything the driver's doing to know how are they manipulating the system to avoid having hours of service violations. What I didn't want to do is, since I actually know exactly what's going on, if you ever had to do compliance monitor, I would know actually exactly where to set up to target compliance. But I didn't want that to be the focus of this talk. Can you advance, please? All right, so we're grabbing the data from the devices, we're sending it to AWS, we're storing it in a Postgres database, on Amazon's S3. We used a bunch of different tools to analyze the data. So you move to the next one. So in this study, this particular one, we had 85,000 drivers, about 15,000 motor carriers, and about 140 gigabytes of data. This was done a couple years ago. The numbers have gone up a lot since then. And we're getting 2-second data from the engine. But if I tried to send all that 2-second data, I'd swamp the data plans. We could, if we wanted to, we could do that. But also, we got very good at programming the mobile device, and so we actually are running a bunch of algorithms on the mobile device to avoid sending it. We're also monitoring all the log edits. We're getting the GPS positions, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and getting the engine bus data. And also, I don't know if I'll play any, but I set up a call center too. It's part of the support, and some of the calls, I set the call center up in the Philippines. And it's really interesting. The Filipinos, they all grew up watching Sesame Street, so their English is actually really good there. And their complaint to me is that the American drivers can't speak English, and they're actually right about that. Yeah, we support French, Spanish, Punjabi, got a whole bunch of the Romance languages. Some of the requests coming in, it's actually pretty humorous when the drivers try to convince the agent to try to make changes. All right, keep going. Down to 2 minutes. Advance, please. All right, so this is an example of some of the hours of violations. On the heat map, the one thing that's interesting is toward the end of the week, in the middle of the day, the color, after color brewer is what we used, was trying to show that people want to get home, don't want to have the hours of service violations. Some of the motor carriers have thousands of these things. Of course, they've been edited out. Can you go advance? This is an example of where they started to edit their driving events to make sure that they weren't exceeding the driving time. The asterisk is, we actually put that in the application to show that they've edited. One of the more interesting edits, we had one more, can you advance please? I looked at some friendly motor carriers from Chicago. Chicago's a hot spot for Eastern European drivers and also a hot spot for fraud. So you can advance. Just advance. One driver was complaining to me. We started to get complaints about an error in our software because we were given the location as 3,366 hours east-northeast of St. John's, Newfoundland. And they were complaining that there was a bug in our software that we had been hacked. Because these things just kept showing up for these 2 or 3 motor carriers. Advance. We traced the location down. What the hackers didn't know, and they're actually not hackers, it's a service bureau, was that they were operating a building in Serbia, in Belgrade, Serbia. Can you advance? And what, in this particular case of fraud, what was actually happening is they'd contracted with a group in Belgrade that was monitoring the drivers, and anytime a driver got close to a violation, they would just adjust his start time. And they didn't know that at that point we were grabbing the GPS from where they were logging on to the second device. This is an example of like extreme fraud and I found out that for $50 a month you can hire this guy, hire this team who'd sort of make sure you never, if you get a violation, if you get caught, it would be a several $1,000 fine. So this is like one of the techniques that they were using to avoid ever having a fine. If you advance, please. Yeah, so 2,600 edits over 146 drivers, I think over a 2-week period to make sure that never had hours of service violation. All right, can you advance, please? I don't have time to play the call center thing, but it is actually really humorous listening to the driver try to convince the agent that in fact, maybe if we get time with that, I'll play it. Anyway, I'm probably out of time here, so are there any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This was very interesting. How can you relate this to truck parking? Because after 10 hours, 11 hours, they get to park, and there are some truck parking shortages in certain states, and states maybe all over the world. So you get truck parking, I'm sure you can see the period also.
Actually, the drivers want to know down to the minute as soon as they can leave. And we actually had to change the software to give them a 30-second window because they would leave too soon. Now, we're really careful. Some of our partners actually have truck parking applications, but we wanted to be really careful not to have channel conflict with them. So we carefully just did only ELD. But certainly we get put into suites with the truck parking applications and the cameras and the tollways, is bunches of them.
Do you have any partners looking at availability of truck parking spaces to guide the drivers? You know, you can't see.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is Trucker Path. That's their business, truck parking. But I mean, there's suites, and basically the industry is going to evolve to suites where you're going to have ELD, fleet tracking, tolling, cameras, analytics, all put, fuel cards, fuel efficiency, all put into a suite. And so our competition is really, we're part of some suites, we're competing with the big legacy providers that sort of try to do this themselves. But that's what the future is going to be for applications like this.
All right, any other questions for Steve?
Yeah, go ahead.
That is the near future. What about the future when we will start seeing autonomous
The problem is, I mean, that's, the near future is a ways off because no one's going to insure it. That's the problem. You know, if you could get insurance, it could go quicker, but you know, who's going to take that liability?
Of course, that's one of not the technology, but institutional problems.
I plan to sell the company before that happens.
You got it.
All right, let's give Steve a round of applause.